Some years ago, I read that a sociologist at Ohio State University had determined that the more frequently people go to church, the more often they have sex. And then a few years later, I learned that a government researcher had concluded that the more frequently you go to church, the lower your blood pressure, presumably because you're getting so much exercise. Well, whatever the consequences, I'm glad to be here this morning, and after what I've just told you, I'll bet you are too. When I concluded my terms as president of our denomination, the Unitarian Universalist Association, I vowed that I would never preach in the pulpit of any minister who had not been kind to me when I was president. That eliminated 50% of the congregations, but not this one. Daniel was not in the ministry when I was president, so he had no occasion to offend me. And I have to say how delighted I am to see the vibrancy of this congregation, the success of your recent building efforts, and all of the enthusiasm and energy which Daniel's leadership with you has provided. It's a real thrill for me. When I was running for president of the denomination many years ago, I used to quip that if I was defeated, people could say of me what Gladstone apparently said of Disraeli: he is a young man with a brilliant future behind him. But now the question for me at a considerably older age is, why would a man with a limited professional future in front of him take up the challenge of being president of our service committee? And the answer is because I truly believe that UUSC is literally the most effective way to put our Unitarian Universalist values to work in the world, to make our faith shine, to make justice roll down like a righteous stream, and to ensure that Unitarian Universalists are in the vanguard of the torrent. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about our work in a moment, and then I hope that you will take one of those envelopes, and if you're not already a member, that you'll join. It's only $40. If you give us $100 or more, your contribution will be matched dollar for dollar by our congregation in Shelter Rock, New York. UUSC gets no support from our denomination. We are dependent entirely upon support of individual Unitarian Universalists like you. But first, I want to tell you about the 8th deadly sin. The 7 deadly sins were first systematized in the year 580 by Pope Gregory I, and they are now part of the Catholic Catechism. And I'm willing to bet that unless you are an ex-Catholic and were a very attentive and guilt-ridden student in catechism class, I'm willing to bet that you can't name all 7, though if I give you a hint, perhaps you can come up with one of them. It is associated with frequent church going. You got it, bingo, lust. But those of you who are sitting there and thinking to yourselves, low blood pressure? You may be right too, because if low blood pressure is making you sluggish, you may be guilty of another one of the deadly sins, sloth, exactly. And then there are wrath, greed, pride, envy, and gluttony. The 7 deadly sins were the early Christian church's roadmap to hell. And by the way, we think of hell and the afterlife as associated with Christianity, but it is not only Christians who worry about the afterlife. You may be familiar with the story of the Orthodox Jew who was on his deathbed, his wife and daughter at his bedside. Moshe, they said, is there anything we can get you? Yes, he said, get me a ham sandwich. Well, naturally, the family was aghast, but they rustled up a ham sandwich, and after Moshe had eaten it, his wife said to him, but Moshe, you've always been such a devout and pious man. How could you do this on your deathbed? And Moshe said, well, look, it's like this. I'm about to die, and when I get wherever I'm going, the Lord will say to me, Moshe, all in all, you've been a good man, but remember that time you stole an apple as a boy? Remember that time you raised your voice to your good wife? Remember that time you were mean to that no-good son-in-law who your daughter married against your advice? Remember the time, and you see, when he gets to the ham sandwich, I'll know it's almost over. What is interesting to me about the 7 deadly sins is that I can well imagine circumstances in which every one of them could be construed as a virtue. Without wrath at the evil of the world, there would be little social progress. Without lust, the race would not procreate. Type A personalities could use a lot more sloth. If we feel insufficient pride in ourselves, we are said to suffer from low self-esteem. And if you are in a refugee camp with little food or clothing, who would really begrudge you greed or envy or gluttony? But there is one very common sin of which we have all probably been guilty at one time or another that in my book is worse than all of them, and that is cruelty. It's hard for me to think of any circumstances in which cruelty could be construed as a virtue. And yet cruelty was not included in the early church's list of 7 deadly sins. Why was that? Well, in the first place, it is because the God whom the early Christian church worshipped was unashamedly a cruel God. Telling Moses to slay all the non-virginal women in Midian, for example, that's but one of dozens of instances. Had cruelty been included in the list of 7 deadly sins, God himself would have had some explaining to do. And though Jesus certainly did repudiate cruelty, no question about that, the early church fathers believed that it was their absolute duty to torture heretics, because if the heretics influenced innocent people with their pernicious beliefs, those poor people would go straight to hell. And so we had to torture the heretics. Cruelty was a small price to pay to protect other people from hell, a small price to pay for salvation. And the other reason that cruelty was not included in the church's official list of sins was because, as I say, virtually everybody does it. Not everybody can be accused of being angry or lustful or lazy or taking an extra flagon of mead at the dinner table, but everybody knows in his or her heart that at some point we've done something at least a little bit mean. Even Jesus had an off day every once in a while. You may remember the time that he was hungry and coming upon a fig tree that was out of season and therefore bore no fruit. He had a bit of a temper tantrum and condemned the poor fig tree never to blossom again. So cruelty is very common, but that makes it no less despicable. And the reason that true cruelty is despicable is not just the obvious one, because it causes suffering, yes, of course, but it is also because cruelty makes the whole world less radiant. That's the connection that Buechner draws in his reading this morning between the beauty of the world and the imperative of doing justice, between what he calls sickening of the heart at the sight of misery and stirring in the blood at the sound of rain. If Unitarian Universalism teaches us anything at all, it teaches us that despite all its carnage and privation and disaster and disease, despite all of that, the world is still full of blessings. The warmth of the sun, the refulgence of the earth, the healing power of our bodies, the companionship of animals, the complexity of our minds, the possible generosity of our hearts, the very breath of life itself. These are all outright gifts that creation presents to us for the taking. We did not earn them. We did nothing to deserve them. They just are there. They're just there. The ever-giving gifts of a radiant universe. They're what the theologians call the manifestations of grace. But, if you have too little water to drink, the sun becomes not a blessing, but a curse. If you despoil the earth with toxins, you no longer have access to the earth's majesty. If you have too little to live on, your complex minds, your generous hearts will shrivel up, and all you will be able to think about is just pure sustenance. If you are tortured, harassed, raped, the very breath of life comes accompanied not by joy, but by agony. So the reason that cruelty is despicable is not just because it causes suffering, though that is certainly true. It is also because it erects roadblocks to life's blessings. It turns what is awesome to ashes. It makes what is gracious about life so much harder to see. So the Service Committee's job, with your help and on your behalf, is to combat cruelty in order to set radiance free. Here are just a handful of ways that we do that. Women in refugee camps in Darfur, Sudan, when they leave the camps to gather firewood, are supposed to be protected by the United Nations police, not raped by them. But unfortunately, that's what happened far too long. The protectors became the rapists until the UN adopted a training and monitoring program for its police designed by UUSC. You did that. You and UUSC, you embraced those women in your protection. Access to clean water. I can't imagine a more gracious gift of the universe than clean water, but in so many places on this planet, including right here in the United States, water is priced out of reach of the poor, or it is simply not available. This is an astonishing statistic. It's the only statistic I'm going to give you today, but it's astonishing. 13% of Native Americans have no access to potable water, more than 1 in 10. UUSC, you and UUSC are changing that all over this country and indeed around the world. Until we see the earth protected as readily as we protect our own children, none of us will be safe from environmental degradation. UUSC and its partners in Ecuador have done an amazing thing. We have convinced that country to include in its new constitution, for the first time anywhere in the world, a recognition that the earth itself has rights. Not just human beings, not just animals, that the earth itself has rights that can be protected. That is a whole new concept in earth justice. You did that, you and UUSC. You made justice roll. 200,000 people were massacred in Guatemala over the past 40 years. 200,000. And not a single one of their killers has ever been brought to justice. But UUSC and its partners in Ecuador are now collecting forensic evidence that will be used in trials to ensure that at least a handful of those murderers go to prison. You did that. No one in this country should live on $15,000 a year. That is what a worker earning the federal minimum wage makes, but that is below the federal poverty line for a family of 3. And by the way, it is also less than the average of what a CEO at an S&P 500 company earns before lunchtime. UUSC is present in Northwest Arkansas, working with poultry workers there whose wages are readily stolen by the companies who have contracted with those workers to do among the most disgusting work in the world. And why are their wages stolen with impunity? Because, of course, most of them are undocumented workers who are afraid to go to the authorities. UUSC works with restaurant workers. The average wage of a restaurant worker is $2.13 an hour. UUSC is convinced that jobs are supposed to lift people out of poverty, not keep them in it. You are changing that. You are doing that. You and UUSC. You are doing all of this. There are many ways in which you in your lives can reflect those values. Our new compassionate consumption campaign identifies those restaurant chains that you can patronize if you want to do economic justice. You're doing all of this. You are making justice roll around the world. And nowhere, one last example, nowhere are you doing that more effectively than a little country called Haiti. Most people, most Americans, have put Haiti out of their minds since the earthquake 2 years ago. Not UUSC. Unitarian Universalists gave over $2 million to put Haiti back together again. UUSC is in Haiti, working with rural people in the Central Plateau, helping them build eco-villages, build sustainable homes, have access to potable water, plant crops to re-timber the Central Plateau that was denuded by the timber companies for many years, experimental crops, economic cooperatives. We are putting Haiti back together again. And by the way, dozens and dozens of Unitarian Universalists are going with us to Haiti every 6 or 8 weeks to do that kind of work, because UUSC has now created what we call the College of Social Justice. And within the next few years, up to 1,000 Unitarian Universalists, UU youth, UU seminarians will go with UUSC around the world to put our values to work on the ground in partnership with people in every part of this world. You are doing that. You and UUSC, you are making justice roll in all these ways. In all these ways, you are doing what the great late evangelical preacher, Reverend Ike, used to call tangibilitating your Unitarian Universalist values. And in the process of combating cruelty, you get 2 bonuses. First, you get a lot more radiance in the world, a lot more happiness, a lot more grace. And second, consider this. You've all heard of carbon offsets, in which people pay for the planting of trees, let's say, to offset, to neutralize their own contribution to greenhouse gases. Well, I like to think of UUSC as my own personal cruelty offset. The next time you wither a fig tree, send a check to UUSC. You'll feel a lot less guilty, a cruelty offset. When you support UUSC, you see you save both the world and your own souls. I was in a congregation about half this size in the Northeast in New England a few weeks ago. I asked them to become members of UUSC. We signed up 70 new members in that congregation. Now, I can't believe that you are going to allow a group of stingy, cold-blooded, mince pie-eating New Englanders to do better than you here in Dallas. We can sign up 70 new members for UUSC. I love our denomination, the Unitarian Universalist Association. I worked for it for 15 years. It deserves our support too. People often ask, what is the difference between the UUA and the UU Service Committee, the UUSC? And it's very simple. The UUA exists to serve the needs of our congregations, and UUSC exists to help Unitarian Universalists serve the needs of the world. It's as simple as that. Because, you see, in the battle against anguish and despair, it's not enough to wish, it's not enough to talk, not enough to worship, not enough to hope, not enough to pray. They're all good, but they're not enough. In the face of tyranny, repression, greed, fear, what is required is to join hands, to use our collective power to combat the 8th deadly sin, to make our voices count, to join with our brother and sister Unitarian Universalists, to join the vanguard of the torrent, to make our values live, to make our faith shine, to let justice roll. Help me do that. Give me your hands, give me your feet, give me your hearts, and give me your money. Together, let's let justice rule. And let the congregation say, Amen.